I'm Sister Paula Jean. I'm director of the Catholic Studies program for the University of St. Thomas, and we are very pleased to have all of you with us tonight for the 8th annual Archbishop J. Michael Miller Lecture. And we are most pleased that our lecturer tonight, our Miller lecturer for year 2011, is Michael Waldstein from Salzburg, Austria, who now teaches and has the Max Seckler Chair of Theology at Ave Maria University in Ave Maria, Florida. Dr. Dominic Aquila, our Vice President of Academic Affairs, will introduce Dr. Waldstein. But I just want to explain a little bit for those of you who do not know what the Miller Lecture Series is about. It has been funded very generously by the Considine Foundation, which was established by Dr. Jim Considine in honor of his mother and father, John W. and Elida M. Considine. And since that time, Dr. Considine endowed this lecture series in honor of Archbishop J. Michael Miller, who had been our acting president here at UST, a Basilian Father. He is now Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Vancouver in British Columbia. But we still hold his legacy here at the University of St. Thomas as we hold the whole Basilian vision of liberal arts and Catholic education here at the university. So Dr. Considine was a great friend of Archbishop Miller's and funded this lecture series in his honor. The vision of this lecture series is to honor each year a lay Catholic professional, somebody who has become an expert in their field. Come in and find a seat. Somebody who has become an expert in their field, not in spite of being a Catholic, but because of being a Catholic. Someone who has truly learned to live the motto of John Paul II, that a real Catholic professional has integrated their Catholic faith with their profession. And so they have become tops in their field, specifically as a Catholic professional. And so we honor an expert in a different discipline each year. And this year, we are honoring Dr. Michael Waldstein, who has done most of his theological work on the writings of John Paul II, and particularly his theology of the body. Dr. Waldstein retranslated the theology of the body and has written a magnificent foreword. So when I teach theology of the body here at the University of St. Thomas, I actually use Dr. Waldstein's text now. So we are very happy to welcome him, and Dr. Dominic Aquila, our Vice President of Academic Affairs, will now introduce Dr. Waldstein. But first I would like to ask Dr. Clark Gormley, who is the new president since Dr. Considine's death. Clark Gormley has taken over the trust, the foundation trust, and is here with us tonight. So please stand up, Clark. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Paula Jean. Members of the UST Board of Directors, Basilian Fathers, Sister St. Francis of the Eucharist, Sisters visiting campus, faculty, students, friends, and guests, welcome to the 8th annual Archbishop J. Michael Miller Lecture, made possible by the generosity of the John W. and Elida M. Considine Foundation. On this feast of St. Michael, which in some universities marks the start of the Michaelmas term. We are honored to have our own Michael, Dr. Waldstein, who will give us this year's Miller Lecture. We are eager to hear his ever-deepening reflections and insights into Blessed John Paul II's theology of the body. Pope John Paul II's writings during the latter half of the 20th century provide us with a blueprint for the new evangelization of the third millennium of Christianity, and none more so than his magisterial theology of the body. This past summer, thanks in large part to Dr. John Hittinger, the director of the University of St. Thomas's Pope John Paul II Forum, UST faculty, high school teachers, pastors, and catechists benefited from a week-long study on the theology of the body led by Dr. Waldstein. And we are so grateful that he has returned to Houston to be with us this evening. Michael Waldstein's career in the academy is one of high distinction. He holds the PhD in philosophy from the University of Dallas, a licentiate in sacred scripture from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and the Doctor of Theology in New Testament and Christian Origins from Harvard University. Dr. Waldstein has taught at the University of Dallas, Harvard Divinity School, and the University of Notre Dame. He is also the founder and president and professor of New Testament of the International Theological Institute in Gaming, Austria, and currently he is Max Seckler Professor of Theology at Ave Maria University. Michael and his wife Susan are parents of 8 beautiful children, one of whom was just recently ordained to the priesthood. Michael and Susie are also members of the Pontifical Council of the family. Michael's journey into the text of the theology of the body started simply enough. He began his own translations from the Italian text of the theology of the body for another project he was working on. And then questions about the text of the book led him finally to the John Paul II archives in the Dom Polski, which is the Polish pilgrim house in Rome. In an interview Michael gave to the Zenit News Service in 2006, he said that he and a friend looked through the Italian materials at the Dom Polski, but found nothing there with respect to some of the questions that Michael Waldstein was bringing to the text. He said, "We were disappointed, but asked the director of the archives if he had anything else." The archive director said, "Yes." He said, "We have the materials of the Polish translation." And all the while, everyone had thought that the Italian was the original text. The curator of the archive said, "There is the Polish translation, but you will find nothing new there that is not in the Italian, because the Italian is the original text." It turns out that Cardinal Wojtyła wrote the theology of the body in Polish before his election in 1978. Continuing in the interview, Michael says, "We became fully sure about the priority of the Polish text only when we managed to contact the sister who actually typed the manuscript in Krakow before John Paul II's election. In the archives, we also found a handwritten note from John Paul II to his secretary that explains that the structure of the theology of the body would remain exactly the same when he adapted it for the series of catechesis, the series which were collected and published as the first edition of the theology of the body. To be sure, the excitement and the importance of this discovery, and I can only imagine the joy of discovery that Michael must have felt when he found all this out, as anyone who deals with archives would know. And that discovery surely stands on its own as a scholarly discovery and achievement. But then add to it Michael's cultivated and creative mind, and we have a discovery with significance not only for scholars, but for much wider and pressing cultural questions of our time. In the same Zenit interview, Michel says, quote, "In the theology of the body, John Paul II was really wrestling with the fundamental questions of our age. The question of progress, of the nature of science, of technology, and its good as well as its dangers. The theology of the body," Michel continued, "is a powerful contribution to the debate about these questions and deserves a hearing." The lecture this evening, entitled "Overcoming the Mechanization of Nature, John Paul II's Theology of the Body," is an instance of the wide cultural importance of the theology of the body that Michel pointed to in his Zenit interview. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Waldstein for the 8th Annual Miller Lecture.
The University of St. Thomas, not only because I was here in the summer to teach, but I got my first job offer here in 1981. I had finished the doctorate in philosophy at the University of Dallas and asked my wife if she was willing to go to Europe to study, wanted to study scripture at the Biblicum. She was doubtful at the beginning, and so I applied for jobs in the United States, and the University of St. Thomas was my first job offer. But then she agreed to go to Rome, so I didn't end up being here. But I've now a number of dear friends here. I'm happy to be with you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, much more generous than deserved. When I told my mother I would get another doctorate, she said, "When you grow old, you lose your mind." By degrees. That may not be so far from the truth, unfortunately, in many cases. On the first handwritten page of the Theology of the Body, up in the corner, one finds these words that you see on the screen. Tota pulchra es Maria. You're all beautiful, Mary. That's a quote of part of the liturgy of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, an antiphon, and it continues, Tota pulchra es Maria, et macula non est in te, and there is no spot in you. And the first page of the manuscript is dated Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1974. That perception of beauty stands at the very foundations of John Paul II's entire pastoral and intellectual project. You find this, it's very easy to remember, on page 123 of his autobiographical work, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. As a young priest, I learned to love human love. If one loves human love, that is the love between man and woman, that's what he was talking about. If one loves human love, there naturally arises the need to commit oneself completely to the service of fair love. Because love is fair, it is beautiful. So the perception of the beauty of love stands in some way at the foundations of John Paul II's project. I'm sorry, I have to scroll back. There's no immediate way to get to the beginning. Here we are. I will spend most of the time of my talk on setting up the problem which John Paul attempts to wrestle with in his theology of the body. That's why I placed Titian's portrait of John Calvin at the very beginning. It's a masterful portrait. Much of the severity of the man emerges in the portrait. A very different portrait you get in this one. He is recognizably the same, although what is emphasized here is the sharp lines of his face rather than the depth of the eyes. I wasn't able to get a high-resolution picture without a word across. Metaverse, the company that did that particular, but they're very deep eyes. It's not an uncommon thing for a young Catholic student to hear, either in college, even in high school before, from a teacher, I have no problem with your believing what your religion dictates. But what I'm telling you is the scientific truth. In fact, it's a great challenge to attempt to live as a Catholic, to attempt to live an intellectual life as a Catholic in contemporary American culture, because it's a culture deeply shaped by its Puritan, that is, Calvinist roots. And they're flowering in the that comes later, in the scientific and industrial revolution. For the most part, those roots don't challenge us in their original religious form, but in a secularized version. You probably recognize this face as that of Richard Dawkins, who was for more than a decade professor for public understanding of science at the University of Oxford. He retired in 2008. Who is a very eloquent representative of this Calvinist heritage. Let's look at a text of his together. It may seem like a paradox to say this. This is his most famous recent book. He writes, "Faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. And who, looking at Northern Ireland or the Middle East, can be confident that the brain virus of faith is not exceedingly dangerous? Given the dangers of faith and considering the accomplishments of reason and observation in the activity called science, I find it ironic that whenever I lecture publicly, there always seems to be someone who comes forward and says, well, of course, your science is just a religion like ours. Fundamentally, science just comes down to faith, doesn't it? Well, science is not religion, and it doesn't just come down to faith. Although it has many of religion's virtues, it has none of its vices. Science is based upon verifiable evidence. If you have a belief that is based solely on faith, I can't examine your reasons. You can retreat behind the private wall of faith where I can't reach you. Science, then, is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. Let's examine that statement in some detail. And I will do this in several steps, in three main steps. First, faith as grasping a reliable testimony. Then faith as unfounded opinion. And then John Paul II's, toward the end, own approach, which consists of this: the experienced power of the beauty of love. When Dawkins talks about faith, he tends to ignore a distinction, an important distinction. But there's another kind of faith. We use the word in another way. For example, I believe this. To take first the sense that Dawkins has in mind, an example would be something like this. I believe that my wife is right now at her desk working on her dissertation on evolution. She's writing on evolution. Not sure about it. This time of the day she usually does work on it, but she may have gotten up to eat chocolate, I don't know. If I were at home with her right now, I would have the evidence. That's the only sense of faith that Dawkins speaks about. But we use the word faith in another sense. Suppose that I'm at home and my wife and I are taking a break from working to have some chocolate. So I open the kitchen drawer to take out the chocolate, but there isn't any. I ask her, "Where's the chocolate, dearest?" And she answers, "So we finished it yesterday, but I got a new supply. It's in the bag over there." When she says that, I don't hesitate to answer, now I know. Thank you. And I say, I know even though I only believe. I have faith in her. I have faith in her word of testimony. Faith without any evidence. Once I pick up the bag and I open it and I see the chocolate, then I have the evidence. And I don't need my wife's testimony anymore. Then I know in some way, in a fuller sense of know. In some way I leave faith behind at that point. But nevertheless, even my faith in her words, it's right to call it knowledge because her testimony is trustworthy. I know her honesty, and I know that she wants some chocolate too. Faith in the sense of reliance on testimony plays an important role in just about every area of human life. How do I know that I am in Houston, Texas right now? I went into a plane and lots of things were zooming by, and then suddenly I was in a place. Well, when I arrived at the airport, it says Houston, Texas on the signs, and everybody here that I asked assures me I'm in Houston, Texas, and I accept those testimonies. I know that I'm in Houston, Texas by faith. I don't have a shred of scientific evidence for it. Now, such faith plays an extremely important role in science itself. Students who start studying chemistry, for example, have little knowledge of the science, but they believe their professor. They say, now I know that DNA has a double helix structure. But the students haven't conducted the experiments on which that truth is based. They accept the professor's testimony on faith. It's quite reasonable. You might think that the situation of the professor of chemistry is quite different. She knows chemistry. She's conducted many experiments. But let's think about how many. Let's be generous and give to our professor one successful experiment for each day. Impossible, but let's be generous. I've talked to our chemists and they have a hard time. That would come to 14,600 experiments if she does it for 40 years. So that number is much too high. But now think about how many experiments all chemists have conducted in building up the hard science of chemistry over the last 200 years, which is what it took. I'm not sure exactly how many experiments they performed, but it must be millions. At any rate, 14,600 experiments are less than 1% of the sum total of experiments performed. Even our professor of chemistry, with that impossibly high involvement in research, must take more than 99% of chemistry on faith. That is, the testimony of those who have done the experiments and have written about them, she reads and accepts. In relation to her science as a whole, she's in a position not unlike that of her beginning students. Nevertheless, she can rightly say about herself that she knows chemistry. Now, Dawkins equates scientific with rational. Here I wanted to put for your meditation a picture about a witness testimony, who for us is central. It's a picture of the scene of Jesus with the adulteress, one of the key teaching moments of Jesus. I'm not sure what art historians say, but it looks to me like the husband is the one on the other side of Jesus with very sharp, angry eyes, and the woman in between. Dawkins equates scientific with rational and faith with irrational. But there are circumstances in which it's quite irrational to be scientific. For example, if I get the chocolate out of the bag and my wife has made some tea, and I sit down with her at the table and I raise the cup to my lips, and then suddenly I jump up and quickly leave the table. I get on my bicycle with a hot cup of tea balanced in one hand, and I rush to the chemical laboratory at Ave Maria University, 2 minutes from our house by bicycle. The tea is probably going to be cooling down a bit. I know the laboratory director, Rachel, and I ask her to test the tea for poison. Because I don't know scientifically whether my wife has put poison into it. And it isn't reasonable for me to believe anything without scientific proof on mere faith. Only science is rational, faith is irrational. Now, Rachel knows my wife, and she won't think that I'm being rational. She'll think that I'm drunk or spent too many hours reading Dawkins. She knows that in these circumstances, it's irrational to be scientific and rational to have faith. Now, in fact, the rationality of scientific knowledge depends in large measure precisely on such faith. One occasionally hears cases in which researchers don't really do the experiments they claim to have made, but they invent the data. It may work for a while, but then when the deception becomes apparent, the punishment is usually very severe, namely a kind of expulsion from scientific research. No more grants. That person is out. No position of professorship at any university. It's a kind of excommunication, not by formal sacred formulas of a bishop, but the academy has its own ways. And the harshness of the punishment underlines the importance of faith for the hard sciences. The rationality of the hard sciences depends on the reliability of the witnesses who contribute to building up the fabric of that faith. Since the only way scientists can possess their hard science is by such faith, since they possess more than 99% of their science only by faith and only a very small part of their own by their own experiments, preserving the rationality of that faith by ensuring the reliability of the witnesses is absolutely vital. Now let's go back to Dawkins. Faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Yeah, you can't eradicate it even from science. Faith being belief that isn't based on evidence, right, it's based on the trustworthiness of witnesses, is the principal vice of any religion and the inevitable virtue of science. Science, then, is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. If it were, there couldn't be a science. Whom do we believe as Christians and why? We believe Jesus, the reason for having this picture on the screen. We trust in his words and in his actions, and we do this because we think he is trustworthy. Our faith in him is eminently rational. Of course, this much is true, that to repeat and verify chemical experiment is important for saying we know, even when we didn't actually perform an experiment. We don't have that ability of reconstructing the direct experience in the case of Christ, who is the eternal Word of the Father. There's one of the key sayings of Jesus. It's called the Johannine thunderbolt in the Synoptic Gospels. It says it very clearly, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Now the question one needs to ask is, what sort of witness is Jesus? What does he know, and how does he know it? If what he says in this saying in the Johannine thunderbolt in the Synoptic Gospels is actually true, then he is the surest and most illuminating witness. And the acceptance of his word and faith deserves to be called knowledge in the highest degree, much more so than the knowledge gained in the hard sciences on the basis of human faith and human testimony. So let me summarize the results so far. Scientific knowledge in the hard sciences is in large measure a human faith. And Christian faith is in large measure a mode of knowledge superior to that gained in the hard sciences and more rational. Paul writes, I'm not ashamed because I know whom I believe. From Jesus, the testimony passed on through his disciples. At the end of the Gospel of John, for example, the editor of the text adds, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. Of course, there's a lot of scholarly ingenuity that has been and is being invested in cutting down the reliability of this testimony. When I went through the New Testament program at Harvard, that's what things seem to be mostly about. I had a fellow student who grew up as an evangelical in Fort Worth, went to Harvard as an undergraduate, lost his faith there, and then decided to study New Testament for the doctorate, in order to prove to himself that he was right. And he succeeded, and he fit in perfectly well with the rest of the New Testament department. I was a little bit more of an oddball in there. The arguments used against the reliability of the New Testament can be summarized by what the director of a film about Jesus said with a kind of disarming simplicity. He said, "I first throw out everything in the Gospels that science tells me can't happen in this universe. Then I try to make sense of the rest." That's basically the formula of the great scripture scholars, Rudolf Bultmann and many others. One of the things science tells us can't happen in this universe is miracles. The gospel narratives are full of miracles. So the filmmaker's principle takes the electrical switch that controls the historicity of the gospel and turns it to the off position in one flip of the switch. What science tells you can't happen, throw it out. That's the first part of my remarks. Faith as grasping reliable testimony. And it turns out that what Dawkins says misses the mark in a rather substantial way. He seems to be completely unaware of the presence of faith in science. Of course, the witness, the testimony of Jesus, the old man, scholar in the law, is looking very carefully what he's going to say, what the next thing is. But the real testimony comes at this point. This is Titian's painting of the good thief. And what I want you to look at especially is the good thief's face. Of course, that of Jesus too. He seems to be dead at this point. His eyes there, it's just a black triangle. But look at the eyes of the good thief. Here's Jesus' face. Here you see the good thief. These little dots of white, there's an immense sense of longing in them. He looks right over and across Jesus' face into the distance. He has apprehended a testimony, and he is looking. That sort of thing seems to be invisible, entirely invisible to Dawkins. But now we come to faith as unfounded opinion. One of the first texts we'll be looking at is a text of Aristotle, a bust of Aristotle, one of the few ones preserved. Oh, faith, as Dawkins defines it in that sense, is belief that isn't based on evidence. Here I want to turn now finally to the concept of mechanism, which is part of the title of my lecture. What is the mechanistic view, briefly? The mechanistic view holds that the universe is best understood as a completely mechanical system. That is, a system composed entirely of matter in motion and a complete and regular system of laws of nature. The mechanists understand the achievement of the scientific revolution to show that every phenomenon in the universe could eventually be explained in terms of mechanical laws, that is, in terms of natural laws governing the motion and collision of matter. That's a definition from the Wikipedia. We forbid our students to use the Wikipedia, but we take our liberty as professors to use it. I don't know how it is at the University of St. Thomas. Do you forbid students to use the Wikipedia? Not recommended.
I don't like it either.
Occasionally you find,
Not for research papers.
right. This is a pretty good definition, it seems to me. Response to what I read. But there's one important element missing in that definition of the Wikipedia, though it's implicit in the concept of natural laws governing the motion and the collision of matter, namely the close relation between the mechanistic conception of science and mathematics. Physics, for example, which is the most basic of the sciences, in some way it's become the new queen of the sciences. Physics proceeds by mathematical analysis of data supplied by experiments. Galileo, who is generally considered one of the founders of modern physics, writes, oh no, this is already the Aristotle. Wait. Philosophy is written in this great book, I mean the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering about in a dark labyrinth. Now, how does Galileo know that this is true? That's a question. There's, on the one hand, this strong inclination to the Pythagoreans and Plato, a certain dislike of Aristotle also. But a more important answer is that he became extremely interested in a particular Aristotelian treatise called the Mechanics, which he thought was genuine Aristotle, though recent scholars believe that it's a work of Aristotle's students. There are several scholars who've presented detailed evidence that Aristotle's, or pseudo-Aristotle's, Mechanics, which wasn't known in the Middle Ages, entered public discourse in the revival of classical studies in the early Renaissance. And it engaged the attention of scholars of widely different backgrounds and interests: classicists, mathematicians, inventors of machines, philosophers of nature, military architects. When you attempt to trace the chain back from Galileo and his mature mathematical and mechanist philosophy of nature, then it turns out that this discussion of the Aristotelian mechanics is exactly that chain. Galileo lectured on the mechanics and wrote a commentary on it that's now lost before he formulated his own new mathematical science. What are the basic theses of that treatise of Aristotle? Let's take a look at a text in which, or of Aristotle's student. Our wonder is excited by what comes to be by techne. We could translate it as technology in this context. It's often translated as art. Contrary to nature for the benefit of human beings. Nature often does the contrary of what is useful for us, for it always follows the same course without deviation, whereas what is useful changes in many ways. When, therefore, we have to do something contrary to nature, the difficulty of it causes us perplexity, and we need techne. The techne, this is now the key sentence, the techne which helps us in such perplexities we call mechanics. The words of the poet Antiphon are quite true. By techne we are powerful, kratumen, even where nature would defeat us. Instances of this are those cases in which the less has power, kratei, over the greater, and where what has small weight moves great weights. In fact, practically all the problems which we call mechanical problems. And that comes something quite interesting that was the guiding principle of the scientific revolution. They're not quite identical, nor yet entirely unconnected with physical problems. They have something in common, both with mathematical and with physical theorems. For while mathematics shows the how, to hos, physics shows the concerning what, to periho. This is Aristotle, here in this case, pseudo-Aristotle's great density of formulation. But for example, when you try to lift a very heavy stone, a lever can provide help. The techne of mechanics uses mathematics to show you the how by calculating the required length of the lever. And it uses physics, in the Aristotelian sense of the science of mobile being, to grasp what the stone is, the lever, as mobile beings with certain properties, hardness, flexibility, etc. So the treatise of the mechanics clearly expresses the interrelation between looking at nature and using mathematics together in the science of mechanics as the path to achieve power over nature. And that Aristotelian account played a key role in the scientific revolution. Francis Bacon, who was for a number of years Lord Chancellor of England, a successor of Thomas More, under King James, of King James Bible fame, even though I hear that was really written in the American South, isn't that right? The King James Bible. No? If the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Bacon explicitly proposes power as the end of knowledge. Of myself I say nothing, but in behalf of the business which is in hand, I entreat men to believe that it is not an opinion to be held, but a work to be done, and be well assured that I am laboring to lay the foundation not of any sect or doctrine, but of human utility and power. Kant chose that text as the motto of his critique of pure reason. Here are some other texts. Human knowledge and power coincide in the same. Scientia et potentia humana in idem coincidunt. Nature is conquered by obeying. Parendo vincitur. And so these twin intentions, namely those of human knowledge and power, truly coincide in the same. Vere in idem coincidunt. And I added here a similar sentiment by Thomas Hobbes, who was for a number of years Bacon's secretary. That itself is a fascinating intersection of major figures. Knowledge is for the sake of power, and the Latin just uses 3 words for it, the Latin of Hobbes. Scientia propter potentiam. This Francis Bacon's fundamental thesis. It's a very common view that Bacon fails to grasp the essential role of mathematics for science, but quite the contrary is true. He fully understands the necessity of mathematics for the new science that he's planning. And the appeal is explicitly to Aristotle. That is, the Aristotelian mechanics. Aristotle said it best: physics and mathematics give rise to practical science and mechanics. Follows from this. We give this precept: everything in nature relating both to bodies and powers must be set forth as far as may be numbered, weighed, measured, determined. For it is works we are in pursuit of, not speculations. Physics and mathematics in due combination give rise to practical science. Here you can see the reason why Bacon is so interested in a concept that gained prominence exactly at that time, partly due to him, namely the laws of nature as the true objects of knowledge. The interest in these mechanical laws of nature is due to the choice of power over nature as the end of knowledge. Because these are laws of actual behavior, they are most useful. And Bacon says, since they're most useful, they are most true. He says, what in operation is most useful, that is most true in knowing. We'll eliminate Descartes a little bit for a while here. I think that axiom has a certain legitimacy when you contrast most true with simply false. But it's incorrect when most true is taken simply in itself, because some truths are not useful. In the case of useless truths, Bacon's axiom functions as a non-cognitive filter that eliminates some kinds of truth, not because they're not true, but because they aren't useful. And the reason for the elimination is not that knowledge has increased and shown these supposed truths to be false, but that the interest in holding on to those truths has faded. Now, Descartes, whom you see here, is even more important for the foundations of the scientific revolution. He studied Bacon and followed him in the choice of power as the end of knowledge. Here you have the clearest text in the Discourse on Method. It's possible to reach knowledge that will be very useful to life. And instead of the speculative philosophy, which is now taught in the schools, that is Aristotelian philosophy, we can find a practical one by which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, as distinctly as we know the various skills of our artisans, we can employ them in the same way for all the uses for which they're fit. And now comes an amazing phrase. And so make ourselves masters and possessors of nature. Masters and possessors of nature. There's a certain grandness in that vision, a certain dizzy grandness. You become master and possessor, not just of a little house, not just of a doggy. All of nature, the stars even, everything will be put to our use. Now, as in the case of Bacon, you can observe a very clear choice in Descartes. Having set down power as the goal of knowledge, he chooses the kind of knowledge that will effectively produce that power. Objects of knowledge that don't fit the purpose of power tend to be excluded. The single most important exclusion that Descartes insists on is the exclusion of the good and of its causality as end. Quote, the entire class of causes which people customarily derive from a thing's end or purpose, I judge to be utterly useless in physics. The next step to saying useless, the next step is to say that goodness, the goodness of the end, is not really an objective property of matter. It isn't measurable. It's irrelevant in any account of the body as body. Now, it's interesting that Aristotle was fully aware of that need to exclude the good from a science that works with mathematical categories. Now, if you consider the consequences of that exclusion of the good or of beauty, we started with beauty. Those consequences are massive. If the body is a mere mechanism, then in itself it is without meaning, without goodness, without beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is, sciences are value-free, and the objective world of facts is value-free. You've heard about the division between facts and values. The fact-value distinction comes from right here, from that point. Here now comes the single most important conclusion of what I've said so far. In the pursuit of power, Bacon, Descartes, and those who follow after him take their point of departure not in a theoretical judgment based on evidence, but in the choice of the will to power, which acts as a non-cognitive selective principle to exclude many modes of being grasped in ordinary experience. Descartes himself doesn't draw attention to the moral character of that first and most fundamental choice. And it's that self-concealment of the choice that gave and still gives to the objective Cartesian view of nature its strength as a quasi-self-evident theoretical starting point. To its proponents, the objective view of nature, that is the mechanical one, is self-evidently the true one. And opposing views are unfounded subjective opinion, romanticism, religious prejudice, motivated by power interest, etc. But the fact remains that at the origin, the objective view is an imposition of will. Leon Kass has a wonderful passage. He says, he's a Jewish doctor and philosopher now in Chicago. Seek knowledge, and knowledge will give you power. But it would be more accurate to say that the new science sought first power over nature and derivatively found a way to reconceive nature that yielded the empowering kind of knowledge. Seek power and you will devise a way of knowing that gives it to you. The result can be simply put. Knowledge permitting prediction and some control over biological and other events has been purchased at the cost of deep ignorance, not to say misunderstanding of living beings, ourselves included. That is, we look at our bodies as machines that came to be accidentally. They're free of meaning, of goodness, of beauty. Those are things we project into them. What we do with our bodies is really a matter of indifference. It depends on our values. But those values are either personally chosen or socially constructed. But they have nothing to do, they have no roots in the body itself. We say what sex means. Let's go back to Dawkins. Science, then, is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. If you define faith as belief that isn't based on evidence, then it's clear that the most vicious kind of faith is a belief that's not merely guilty of the fault of not being based on sufficient evidence, but a faith that is willfully imposed on things despite the evidence, due to some interest that you have, in this case, the interest in power. That willful imposition is exactly what Dawkins embraces, I think, in ignorance of the actual historical origins of the mechanist picture of nature, which were created by the excessive claims on behalf of mechanics. So in his case, it may be an inherited vice, not a personal one. Although when you look at his face, there's an intensity in it that it's hard to fathom the man. So far, the first two parts of my talk, faith as grasping testimony, its massive presence in science, faith as unfounded opinion, to some degree present in science. Of course, let me add, there's no doubt that we discovered much truth on this path opened up by Bacon and Descartes. That should be said outright. And the problem is not so much in the science of mechanics itself. The problem lies in making excessive claims for it as the master road into reality. But that's exactly what people like Dawkins do. If you're the Pope and you're faced with that situation, what is it that you would do? You can immediately see how a view of the body like that undercuts the entire fabric of Catholic sexual morality, because the body is meaningless. You can do with it what you want as long as you respect other persons. It's okay. Whether a man gets married to a man, the plumbing doesn't work perfectly, but that's all it is. It's plumbing. It doesn't have any significance. So we have about 5 minutes. And maybe we can unfold, I can unfold a little bit more in question and answer period, this answer of John Paul. One way of responding to the crisis would have been to write historical and philosophical tracts that explain some of its history, that explain the rationale of Catholic understanding of the body in metaphysical terms. And there are people who are doing this. But John Paul II's is another one. Namely, he appeals to the experience. Very early on in his career, in his intellectual life, he had a profound encounter with the writings of St. John of the Cross, who's the great master of Christian experience, that is, of observing how what it actually means and how it actually looks like, how it feels when you are in relation to God. That's the path he chooses in his theology of the body. That is to point out from the teaching of Jesus, and principally from the book of Genesis, that our own experience, the experience of our own body, teaches us the fundamental truths proposed by Jesus. Now, experience itself wouldn't be enough, because you can experience something and not be persuaded by it. There's the second aspect that I mentioned at the beginning, namely beauty. He was fascinated by the beauty of love. And that sense of the beauty of love in human experience comes across all the time in his writing. That's, I find, the persuasive power of his writing. Just to give you a very basic idea, let me go through the first 3 steps that he takes in reading Genesis. You're probably familiar with them. Original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness without shame. Each of those descriptions he takes to be descriptions of experience. Original solitude. God says, it's not good for the man to be alone. Let's find him a help that is like him. That's the translation he chooses. The Hebrew can be translated in different ways. And then God does a strange thing. He brings the animals to the man, as if to test. Does the cow work? Does the cat work? So, imagine the man sitting there, and the cow approaches. And what does the cow do? The cow comes and looks at the man, kind of. And the man says, hello? And the cow says, it's a disappointment, yeah. That is, he grasps himself in a bodily way as personal, and he grasps the cow in a bodily way as not you. And therefore, he's still alone. If you go on a mountain tour and you tell me you went through the woods all by yourself, and somebody tells you, no, you weren't all by yourself. There were hundreds of trees around you. Well, you were alone because these trees were not we. You can't say we to them. So that's the first experience he points to. It's a bodily experience of a man sitting or standing there. I don't know what he was doing. The animals come, and he grasps himself bodily as a person. This is I, in a way in which the cow doesn't say I. On that basis, when the woman comes, and the man says, this one finally, after all these animals that I had to look at, this one finally is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And then Jesus says that God said, for this reason a man shall leave father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh, which are words of power. Recognizing her as another person, the man recognizes that his body, as a sexual body, is made for belonging to her and vice versa, for the gift of self. It's again an apprehension of the meaning of the body. Do you see how that immediately bears on the reduction of the body to mechanism? That is, it's an experience in which you grasp, this is me. And me is not an imposition of some value on this, but that's the reality. So he strikes at the very core of the mechanistic account, which is the fruit, once again, of the ambition for power over nature. Then in nakedness without shame, if in the original innocence of human beings, this relation of gift is undisturbed and untroubled, there's no need for protection, for covering yourself. You can show yourself with completeness, in peace, because the gift and its reception makes sense. It's not threatened by any factor. That's the measure. Those three experiences in some way become the measure John Paul then applies throughout this theology of the body. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you would like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waldstein. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
But it was just an enticement to what you have promised in the Q&A. So hopefully we can continue to unfold what you've just begun to open up for us in these last couple of moments where it got really exciting. So we will entertain any questions to further unfold John Paul's theology of the body, particularly as a very perceptive response to the cultural, philosophical phenomenon which we are all immersed in.
And
So-
I apologize if I spent so much time on the coming to be of the mechanist account of nature, but for Catholics to come to grips intellectually with the culture in which we live, that's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the theology of the body could remain a kind of romantic experience that doesn't really engage the culture.
Exactly right.
I had the honor of taking Professor Waldstein's classes already, so I've already got a chance to ask him about other things, but this is a great opportunity for me now. I would like to know your thoughts on this. Leon Cass also points out that the first action that the man and the woman take after committing the first sin is an act of techne. They sew themselves garments. I'd like to know, do you have any thoughts on what the difference is, or is there a difference between that primal act of sewing themselves garments and the sort of mastery of nature that we see in Bacon and
Absolutely,
Descartes?
yeah. In the account of original solitude and original unity, and especially when he talks about nakedness without shame, John Paul says that the untroubled acceptance of your own body and the body of the other, following God's judgment, it was very good. Okay, that untroubled acceptance of your own body and of the body of the person you love is the basis for accepting all other visible things. That is, you're given the standard, as it were, for relating to the cow that came by earlier. Not that you'll imitate what happens in relation to the woman with the cow, but in the sense that you have the same peaceful relation to it. It's interesting that the task of the man when he's created is described as keeping, guarding, and to some degree tilling the garden. So some kind of labor is there already before the fall, but it seems to be that of a gardener. Immediately after the fall, a whole series of technological events takes place, of which the construction of clothes is the first. But already in talking about the punishment, God talked about an enmity between nature and the man, with thistles instead of corn coming out, as you've seen this summer in Houston. Yeah. And then a whole series of other events, Cain founding the city, metallurgy, and so on, which is not simply a condemnation of technology, but certainly makes you think about what are the criteria for theology. Well, at the period of the founding of the scientific revolution, those cautions seemed to disappear completely. Bacon thought if we just got our act together, everything would be perfectly fine. Descartes expected that within his lifetime, with the inventions that he made in mathematics and in medicine, we would overcome death. He died, and it was an absolutely dizzy time. Now, it's interesting that in the period of the 60s, many Catholics finally caught up with that dizziness. That is, we were reminded so often about Galileo. The church really missed the boat there, didn't it? It didn't follow the progress of science, but it locked Galileo in a house. Terrible. And so we need to get with it and follow the progress of the human race along the path of science. That was a big thing among Catholics in the 60s. And I think the principal reason why the issue of contraception became so hot, I think many Catholics considered the church allowing contraception something like, what is it? The green card for entering the land of progress and being able to work in it. And by refusing to allow contraception, the church was excluding itself once again from the modern world. The theology of the body is centrally concerned with this issue of contraception, but it embeds the discussion of that in a much larger context into which it belongs, namely that whole historical development of mechanist understanding of nature and a direct attack on it. Once again, not to say that certain things we found in physics aren't true. They are. But not to think that that's the whole picture of the human body. A long answer to a... Please.
Yes, Dr. Waldstein. The quotation you have from the Discourse on Method,
Yeah.
I think you described as the mastery of nature formulation, which Bacon also has something similar to that, the relief of man's estate. I think you said that was, how did you put that? Dizzying, yeah. Dizzying, yes. And I was struck by that. If we had the next sentence there that follows right after that, Descartes, I'm paraphrasing, Descartes says something like, you could ask yourself, okay, we can become masters and possessors of nature, so what, why? And Descartes furnishes the answer. This is desirable, he says, because we can produce an infinity of devices, that's your techne again, the technology, so that we will be able to enjoy the fruits of the earth without pain.
Yes.
Sans pain in the French. Now that's even more dizzying, I suppose, because to enjoy the fruits without pain sends off alarm bells, because we think of the expulsion from Eden, where the fruits of the earth are to be enjoyed with pain, with trouble, with the curse that you mentioned. But now modern science, and this is probably why Richard Dawkins is so enthusiastic about it, can deliver us from the ancient curse, not because of God's dispensation, but because of scientific achievement. And I was wondering if you had some ideas about how to connect that up, the prospect of enjoying the fruits of the earth without pain, with your comments about mechanism.
Yes, that's an excellent question. It's a fact that parallel with the rising of the scientific revolution, there was the rise of an ethical system called utilitarianism, which aims everything at some form of pleasure. Kant, and there John Paul II agrees entirely with Kant. Kant was worried that this way of looking at things, and especially of human beings at each other, if I look at a human being from the point of view of the possibility of that object giving me pleasure, that's a profoundly demeaning thing to do with another human being. It's this ethics of utilitarianism oriented toward pleasure and the reduction of pain leads to incredible violence against the person and to a suppression of the dignity of the person. So Kant was, as far as I can see, this is one of the main forces at work in Kant. He attempted to establish the dignity of the person, to counteract that force of the utilitarian system. Now, the big difference between Kant and John Paul II seems to me this, that Kant, as many academics do, simply bowed down in front of Newton and said, yeah, that's the true picture of the world. So you accept the mechanist account of the body, and then, as a second step after accepting that, you try to find some way of fitting human dignity into the picture. And it doesn't work, because ultimately you're going to have a body without value and a person somehow connected with it, that somehow connected with it, but not really connected with it. And John Paul's genius, I think, consists in, you could put his point in this way, not cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, but sede ergo sum, I sit, therefore I am. Because when you sit and you feel the pressure of your behind on your seat, that's you. That's personal. And that perception makes a huge difference in erotic relations.
You talked about how the theology of the body connects to the sciences, especially modern day science. My question is, how do you think theology of the body connects to modern art? And this includes film, television, and literature, not just paintings.
Yeah. Another fabulous question. Yeah.
I'm a student, by the way.
In the paintings that you saw, the Titian paintings especially, they reflect a sense of the body as expressive. That is, and think of it, this is really an amazing thing, and we kind of take it so much for granted that we hardly stop at it. But when I look at you, I see you look, which is really a remarkable thing. I mean, I don't only see blobs of color there, and I don't just abstractly suppose that something goes on behind these blobs of color, but particularly in a smile, you grasp an interiority expressed in the body. You can see somebody think. I have some pictures of John Paul II here at the end. I don't know how that picture was taken. It must be a candid shot. But it's an expression of thought. You can see a powerful interiority there in the man. That's what the human body is. It has within it objectively a meaning, a deep meaning, actually in it. Here you see him not look inside, but you see him look out, listening. But it's in that man, objectively. Here, once again, he is listening intensely, expressing affection in a bodily way. That boy for him is not a biochemical mechanism that happens to have come together in a particular way, but he touches him as a person. Another image of interiority. Here, a young family that happens to be, when we first came to Rome, we went to one of the audiences in the Vatican when he was actually doing theology of the body. And because we arrived with blonde children, the people way in back said, "Go, go, 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 go," because he stops when there are children. And he did stop when there were children. Already at that point, I really loved him, so you can see that. Yeah, in those examples, you see how meaning is in the human body. An art that accepts a fundamentally mechanist account of the body is in a certain way cut loose. That is, it has to create meaning out of thin air. It can't draw it from things. Now, that's not to say that the only art that's legitimate is realistic representation, because there are many ways of drawing meaning out from it. That's my favorite picture. There are many ways of drawing meaning out. But if there's none there, then you have to create it, and you find yourself in a vacuum of choice. Of, shall it be this? Shall it be that? That seems to me the basic problem of art at the moment.
I'll take one final question.
Yes. Since you began with that Toto pulchr es Maria, you are all beautiful, Mary. Perhaps to return there in this, that overcoming the mechanization of nature and the theology of the body. In our Catholic tradition, the Aristotelian analysis of change or causality is very important, with the material, efficient, formal, and final causality.
Final cause, right.
Is it correct in your understanding that a mechanization of nature, or beginning with Francis Bacon and science, has elevated the causality of the material and the efficient, but in many ways neglected what is central to the spiritual, and that is the formal and the final causality in its understanding?
Since this is the final question, my answer is yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, we are very grateful to Dr. Waldstein for his presentation. And before you fly the coop, I want to make a presentation.
I was promised a teddy bear.
But it's square.
It's
You can open it. We wrap it well so he can take it home in his suitcase.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. very nice.
It's from the University of St. Thomas, Archbishop J. Michael Miller Lecture Series 2011-2012, Michael Waldstein, Mechanized Nature and Theology of the Body in Recognition of Excellence as a Catholic Professional, Linking Faith and Culture. And Dr. Waldstein's name has been added to our plaque of all of the Miller Lectures, which is just outside the door as you enter. So
thank you very much.
congratulations and thank you, Dr. Waldstein.
Thanks.